I'm here today as part of an education. Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Sorry to interrupt you there, Evan.
That's all right. Not a problem. Yeah, so this, anyway, so the new Act is radically different from the 1972 Act. Whilst the Aboriginal Heritage Act of 1972 was revolutionary for its time, being the first Act to recognise Aboriginal heritage in Australia, it is 50 years old now, 51, and it's outdated. So we have created a whole new piece of legislation, and with that, a whole lot of regulations and statutory guidelines in which to operate the Act. So previously, there was a group called the ACMC in Perth, and they were making assessments of Aboriginal people's cultural heritage. That will no longer be the case. If Aboriginal cultural heritage is recognised as being important to an Aboriginal person, it gains protection under the Act. And it is important to say that all Aboriginal cultural heritage in WA is protected. It doesn't have to be listed on a directory. It doesn't have to be known about currently. It is protected under the Act, and all activities that risk harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage do need to go through an approvals process. Proponents need to undertake that due diligence prior to undertaking their activities. That will ensure that they're aware of whether there is or isn't cultural heritage in the area, and they will understand the approvals pathway in which they need to take. The approvals process itself requires engagement with Aboriginal people, and it does vary depending on the type of activity. It acknowledges, it provides roles for native title holders, knowledge holders, and traditional custodians. We have the ability for Aboriginal organisations to register themselves as LARCs. Now, there are a lot of acronyms, I do acknowledge that. The LARCs are the local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services. So they are the local voice for Aboriginal cultural heritage and they will be appointed specific to the areas. And in areas where there is a LARCs designated, they will act as a one-stop shop so that Landcare users such as yourselves will know who it is to go to in that area, and they can have confidence in the process that they are speaking to the correct people. We've also substantially increased the penalties for breaches. So previously we were standing at 100,000. That's been increased to 10 million. There's potential for jail time in cases of severe harm that occurs to cultural heritage. And in addition to that, we've increased the time frames around that. So from, it currently stands at 12 months, and they've increased the statute of limitations to 6 years now. So there's a whole new suite of protective tools that are going to be coming into place, including stop activity orders, prohibition orders, protection orders, and so forth. As of this morning, we have just gazetted all of the statutory guidelines. So there are still some regulations that will be coming into effect, and all of them will be ready and online by July 1 when the whole system goes live. But as of this morning, they've been gazetted and they're available from that link. Hopefully, you should be able to click on that link there on the screen, and that will take you to where those documents are. If that's not working for you guys, then what I will do is send through a full copy of the full presentation. I'm just giving you a short version today for looking at those guidelines, and I'll send you the links to all those things.
Thanks, Evan. And Casey, you can pop that in the chat. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, fantastic. And those guidelines are designed essentially through a process of consultation and co-design, and they're there to guide proponents and to support Aboriginal people in navigating legislative framework to protect and to manage Aboriginal cultural heritage. So as I said, there's a swathe of tools that have come through which are there to protect cultural heritage, including mandatory consultation, mandatory due diligence, agreement making, informed consent. And the majority of these tools are actually new tools coming into place to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage. The only two that have asterisks on the slide there in front of you are the blanket protection and the protected areas. The asterisk is there because those two items have come across from the 1972 Act. The rest of them are completely new. What we mean by blanket protection is, as I said before, that all Aboriginal cultural heritage, regardless of whether it is known, regardless of whether it is recorded, whether it's listed on the directory, is protected. And in addition to that, we're bringing across protected areas, which are areas of outstanding significance. So there are certain areas which of Aboriginal cultural heritage, whilst all Aboriginal cultural heritage is protected, there are areas where they are of such outstanding significance that no impacts should occur to those areas. And knowledge holders can acknowledge those areas and designate, apply to have them designated. And once they're designated, they will be afforded the strongest protections underneath the legislation. In addition to that, we've created a new definition for Aboriginal cultural heritage. We're developing new approvals pathways, including management plans and ACH permits, guidance material, which I'm going to walk you through briefly today, and increase things like greater transparency, contingencies for new information to come out, and the additional groups that we have are coming in as part of the legislation are a majority Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Council. Now, unlike the ACMC, they won't be in charge of deciding whether ACH is significant or not, or whether it should be harmed or not. They are there to designate those local Aboriginal cultural heritage services, and they're there to ensure that the approvals processes are done correctly. They're there to act as a mediator and a voice to ensure that the local Aboriginal cultural heritage is represented by the local Aboriginal people. So in terms of the purpose of the Act itself, we look to, in any Act, we look to the objects of the Act to decide what it is that is the purpose of the Act. And in this, I've got a couple of highlighted passages here. The purpose of looking to these is it guides the rest of legislation. So whenever there's a question about what is appropriate or in what way the Act should be read, you look to the objects of the Act, which are informed by the principles. So the purpose of this Act is to recognise, protect, conserve and preserve Aboriginal cultural heritage. And it's also about managing those activities that may harm Aboriginal cultural heritage. And it's got to be done in a way that gives clarity and confidence and certainty to everyone. So that means that the Aboriginal people whose heritage it's important to, and also to land users, can both have certainty and confidence in that process. And the aim is to produce balanced and beneficial outcomes for the Aboriginal people and for the wider Australian community. So in pursuing that, we look to the principles. So in terms of Aboriginal cultural heritage, that Aboriginal people should, as far as practical, be involved in that recognition, in that protection, conservation and preservation of ACH. And they should also be involved in the management of activities that can harm ACH. And as far as practical, in order to utilise land across WA for the optimum benefit of the people of WA, the values held by Aboriginal people in relation to the Aboriginal cultural heritage should be prioritised when managing activities that might harm Aboriginal cultural heritage. So it's these value statements that we look to when operating the Act. As I've alluded to already, we have created a system where there can be a local voice for Aboriginal cultural heritage. It shouldn't be up to a committee based in Perth to decide what's significant in the Pilbara or the Western Desert or up in Kununurra. It should be up to the local Aboriginal people who know and value and understand their heritage. It also provides certainty because proponents can have that conversation directly with appropriate people and know that they have that understanding of who the correct knowledge holders are and that they are being consulted and having conversations in an appropriate way. And that's done under the oversight of the ACH Council. Now, on July 1st, there won't necessarily be any LARCs appointed. There are I think 84 PBCs across the state, and we've had conversations with a great number of those. I think we've had about 25 conversations one-on-one with them, and about 80% are putting up their hands to be designated a LARCs. There's a lot of positive reasons a PBC may want to become a LARCs, but it is an opt-in system, which means that this Act will work even if there's no LARCs designated for an area. In that case, the proponent needs to come to the PBC and have the conversation about what approvals and what cultural heritage may be in that area. But in addition to that, a proponent will need to make sure that they are speaking to the correct knowledge holders.
Evan, now, can I just jump in and
yes,
clarify a question in the chat? What is a PBC? The prescribed body corporate, but if you can take us through that, please.
Okay, so prescribed body corporates are they're Aboriginal parties that have been designated as the native title holders, and that's done under a different piece of legislation, which is an Australian Commonwealth piece of legislation rather than a state of WA legislation. They're the designated native title holders for a specific area. So they've gone through a process whereby they have acknowledged they've been acknowledged for their connection to their country. And in recognition for the process that they have gone through in being recognised as the native title holders, the WA system looks to those groups initially as the key Aboriginal stakeholders for an area. And that's why it's generally speaking a PBC that you will go to discuss what's an appropriate, to discuss the appropriate Aboriginal cultural heritage in the area. Now, in some areas, the people, like where I am in Mirror and Gadgerong country, the PBC has a very strong relationship with all knowledge holders on country. They represent them and they have great working relationships with local organisations around here. So they've already got that conversation going. They know what's going on country, and they know what the approvals that are going to need to happen. And there are areas of the state like Perth, which have got ILUAs issued over them. But in addition to those people that are recognised in the PBC, there are additional knowledge holders who choose not to be part of the PBC. They say that the PBC doesn't recognise their values, their views, sorry. And in the case where a PBC isn't a LARCs, then a proponent needs to make sure that they've gone to that PBC and they've gone to those knowledge holders to discuss what's going on. There are areas of our state, in particular the goldfields, in which native title determination hasn't occurred. And in those cases, the people you need to speak to are the native title bodies. Now, we're developing a new IT system to go along with this. And what that IT system is going to do, amongst a suite of other things, is provide a mapping system in which you can look at the area where you want to perform your activity, whether it's fencing, whether it's revegetation, whatever the activity is, and you can look to that area and find out who the correct people to contact are. It may not list all the knowledge holders for that area, and we've developed a set of guidelines to help you look to those in case you do need to undertake an activity tier 2 or tier 3 and identify the correct knowledge holders. But where there's a LARCs, they will be listed on the system. They'll have all their contact details, and it will be as simple as picking up the phone or sending an email to get in contact with those groups.
Thanks, Evan. There's just that point in the chat for clarification where the 6 regional corps are now across the Iluas in WA, because a lot of Noongar country don't have PBCs. They would be the appropriate body for people to approach?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so when you want to undertake an activity, the first thing, yes, all right. So in terms of those activities, we've developed a set of policy objectives which guide the way in which they're supposed to be done. So the point is for Aboriginal people and proponents to work together to reach agreements about the management of ACH. ACH is the acronym for Aboriginal Cultural Heritage. Land use activities must be managed in a way that avoids, or if it can't avoid, that it minimises harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage. It does allow for reasonableness to come into that equation. So where it is reasonable to avoid and minimise harm, which is where that level of balance comes in. We're developing a system that provides clarity and certainty of process and consultation so that a proponent can know when they come into the system who they've got to speak to and what they've got to do, and they have that clarity and certainty that they can get it done correctly within the law. We've developed a system that facilitates the making of well-informed decisions so that it can be clear to all parties what it is that needs to occur. Approvals process, where the effort put in to seek the approval is on par with the level of impact that an activity may cause. So under the 1972 legislation, it was very much a one-size-fits-all approach, and any activity that impacted Aboriginal cultural heritage required an approval, whether that was very low-level activities like walking across country, all the way up to building a new mine. All of those activities, if they impacted Aboriginal cultural heritage, did require an approval. Now, that isn't something that was happening. And therefore, we've created a new system in the legislation so that the level of impact that's possible from an activity is measured alongside the level of approval that would be required. Aboriginal people need to be involved in that decision-making process, and the approvals, as I've said, are only required if your proposed activity may harm heritage. So in cases where you are going to be putting a fence line up, or whether you're going to be digging new foundations for a dam, if your activity isn't going to be harming Aboriginal cultural heritage, then there's absolutely no requirement for any approvals. So this isn't a case of going out and getting a permit for every single activity across WA. It's going out and getting the correct approval for activities that affect Aboriginal cultural heritage. So as I was discussing that approvals pathway, there are certain activities which will be considered exempt. So we do have a large list of those, and they are available on that guidelines link that I said, and that we'll send through to you if that didn't work for you guys. We've got exempt activities, which include things like emergency services. So when a bushfire is coming through that threatens life or animals, then those kind of activities are exempt. By saying exempt, we're recognising that they do have the potential to harm Aboriginal cultural heritage, but they are necessary to occur, they must occur, and therefore they are exempt. So in terms of driving across a track, camping, small-scale residential, which means anything that's happening on a block of land that is smaller than 1,100 square metres, recreational activities, they don't require an approval. What we do request is the proponents are encouraged to avoid, where possible, harm to ACH, but if you've got an exempt activity and you're not in one of those protected areas, you don't require any approval. You are protected under the legislation from any prosecution against harm. Tier 1 activities are about minimal ground disturbance. So fencing is a big example. Rock chipping, another example of a tier 1 activity. These are activities that minimally have ground disturbance. They don't require any approvals. They don't require any consultation or discussion with Aboriginal people, but they do require a proponent to take all reasonable steps to avoid and minimise harm. That means if you're aware of an artefact scatter, for example, in an area, and you can reasonably run your fence around that scatter, then you should do so. If it isn't reasonable for you to do that, for example, you can't move it 10 metres to the west because you don't have tenure 10 metres to the west, then that is the way in which you can fence through that. But if it is reasonable, you're obliged to avoid harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage. Tier 2 activities, low ground disturbance activities require a permit. Those activities require notification of the correct party, so that would be the LARCs in most cases where there's a LARCs designated, or the PBC and the knowledge holders, or the native title body in cases where those don't exist. Tier 3 activities are the moderate to high ground disturbance activities. So they're anytime you get a bulldozer involved, those are your significantly ground disturbing activities. Those require Aboriginal cultural heritage management plans. So these are this is the difference, as I sort of indicated, between, on the top of that, we've got the 1972 Act, which required a one-size-fits-all approach, no due diligence, no consultation, the minister's making a decision and its approval is granted in perpetuity. The new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act is looking at splitting all those activities up, and these are the sort of processes in which you would go through to have your activity approved. So I won't go through those in detail because those are listed elsewhere, and I do have limited time and I want to get to your questions. But this is sort of highlighting the major difference between the two acts.
Great. Can I jump in there, Evan, with a couple of questions from the chat?
Absolutely.
This is from the Katanning Landcare team. Which tier does cropping, pasture sowing for established farming fall under?
Okay, so rather than me having a look through those documents, what I will say is that we have created a table which is available. It's part of the gazetted guidelines, and we've created a table which details activities across WA. So we've this was the item that required the most consultation and involvement from proponents and Aboriginal groups. We had a working group which took experts and industry bodies from WA activities and looked at all the different things that might occur and what levels of impact they had. And we've created an activity tier table, which is, as I said, available from that link. It's gazetted.
Can you please mute everyone? Sorry, we've got some background noise from somewhere.
Okay, yep, sorry. Those activity tiers are quite extensive, but they are stepped out very clearly. What we've tried to do in there is divide them up by activity types. So general activities, activities that affect agriculture, natural resource management activities, anything affecting waterways, mining activities, surveying activities, emergency activities, investigation activities. And what we've tried to do is split them up to give you an indication of where it is that you might want to look. So for activities impacting agriculture and natural resource management, we're looking at Division 5, and that considers activities like feral pest control, weed management, creating new pastoral stations and so forth. And it will specifically look at those activities and tell you what tier they're in. That's initial part of your due diligence process, is to work out what tier you need to be in. We've stepped it out and made it sort of clear. We've tried to make them into different areas, but if you're building a road or clearing a piece of land, that's an activity that might a lot of different groups might do. So farming groups might be clearing lands, and main roads will be creating roads. So what you'll need to do is review the entire document and see where your activity fits. If it's not clearly stepped out, you can ask the department that question. You can say, where does this activity fit? And we will have officers that will specifically be involved in answering those questions. And if it doesn't fit neatly under one of those categories, we've created a final section, which is the catch-all. So where your activity isn't clearly stepped out, you can have a look and see whether it is removing, for example, a tier 1 activity is removing between 4 and 20 kilos of material in one calendar year in any one area. It becomes a tier 2 activity when you're removing greater than 20 kilos. No, it becomes, sorry, I'm misreading. It becomes a tier 2 activity if it's 4 to 20. It becomes a tier 3 activity if it's moving greater than 20 kilos of material. And that's referring not to the activity as a whole, but within that area of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So if you're going to be digging a number of holes within Aboriginal cultural heritage, you're going to be clearing off the surface. If that surface area is greater than X, then it falls under certain categories.
Thanks, Evan. And you can, so I'm not sure if you can see the chat easily where you are, but as you would understand, the complexity of the Act and the changes that it will require in practice for community land care and NRM practitioners, apparently, seems pretty significant at this point. And, that questions about, is hand weeding considered minimal or low impact? One of our audience has put a link in there to say page 25 in the document. Casey has advised everyone we'll be sending that email out. But Alan from Noongar Land Enterprises asked, how will the average person know if what they are doing is impacting? So it's how's that information really going to get out there, I guess, is the question, Evan.
Yeah, okay. So it will very much depend on those activities, and as your audience pointed out, they are all in there. So controlling pests is a tier 1 activity. It just really kind of depends on the level of impact. What anyone that's going to be doing an activity will need to do is a process of due diligence. They will need to go to our new IT system called Acknowledge, which will be available from the 1st of July. That's a very simple point and click mapping process where you will be able to highlight the area of your activity and zoom in to see whether there are any Aboriginal cultural, whether there's any ACH listed in that area. Now, depending on your level of activity, we have the management code, and the management code will step out what it is that a proponent needs to do to be reasonably confident that there isn't Aboriginal cultural heritage in that area. So for a tier 1 activity, if it's not listed on the directory and you go to the area and you do a visual look around and you don't see anything, we're not expecting everyone to suddenly be heritage professionals, but if you're out there rock chipping and you see a petroglyph, then a person doing that rock chipping can be reasonably confident that that area is probably Aboriginal cultural heritage, and they should reasonably avoid it by doing their rock chipping on the boulder next to it, which doesn't have any rock art on it. In terms of Tier 2 activities, you do need to do a greater level of understanding whether or not there's cultural heritage in the area. It isn't enough just to rely on the directory in that case. You'll need to look up to see whether there are reports available on our system, and go through that process of investigating those. If it's really not clear, then you're going to need to have a permit. In Tier 3 activities, if it's not clear, you'll probably need to do a heritage survey in those cases. Now, it's all very well for me to sort of say this right now here, but we've actually stepped these out in documents which are available for someone to rely on. So in terms of doing your due diligence, in terms of finding out whether you've got cultural heritage in that area and whether your activity is going to cause harm to that cultural heritage, that due diligence is that way in which you're going to protect heritage, but more than that, it's your defence against so it's your legal defence against the offence of causing harm. So if you do your due diligence according to the ACH management code, which is available online, if you've done it correctly, if you've done it as per the code, then you have a defence in court in cases where you do harm ACH. Now, I understand that there's a number of groups here today. Jack, let me know that there's Aboriginal corporations here, DBCA, DFES, number of other groups. The education team, me as part of it, are doing workshops around the country. We're also willing to respond to any emails that you guys send us, and we're happy to come out and do individualized workshops with you guys and to run you through them step by step, what it is that you need to do. So you can join in one of our sessions around the state, which are happening, registration available from our website. You can contact us via our email, which I have at the end of our document. And you can let us know what it is that you need to know, and we can answer those questions for you. We don't want to leave you in the dark. We're not going to be coming out on July 1st and prosecuting a whole lot of people for causing harm, but we do want to make it clear to everyone the new processes that they will have to go through to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage.
That's great, Evan, and it's long overdue. It's just a case of the extent and magnitude of the change. Yes. And the adaptation time that people have. Is there some form of caveat period for people to get accustomed to the system, or from 1st of July, once the Act is enacted, does that mean that it's all live? There's no sort of soft start up to this? Because no, okay.
No, so there's not.
1st of July is here. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. So from the 1st of July, if someone is maliciously harming Aboriginal cultural heritage, then there is the possibility of them being prosecuted under the legislation.
That's a really important word, isn't it? Is malicious. There's malicious is in that phrase. That's a legal term by the sound of it. So it's highly unlikely that our member groups or the people in this conversation today, in wanting to undertake, say, as we've got in the chat, fencing, revegetating and protecting a creek line on a private property, or hand weeding or weeding, controlling pest animals, burying some bait, they're very unlikely to be prosecuted for causing malicious harm if they've gone through that process and sought to do the right thing. Is that right?
Well, the purpose of this Act most, in a biggest broad sense, is to start conversations. It's about knowing that whilst the directory at the moment has 40,000 places listed as cultural heritage, we know that that's not the extent of Aboriginal cultural heritage across this country. We have no idea of knowing whether it's in the millions. The significant sites are still out there. We're such a there's such a variety in development across the state that there are there's always going to be the possibility of coming across new Aboriginal cultural heritage. And it's about having that conversation with the people to which that Aboriginal cultural heritage is important. It's about having that conversation with Aboriginal people. So you're going to be undertaking an activity. Is there a possibility that this activity is going to cause harm? What do I need to do about that? It's simple conversations that need to happen. It's about developing those relationships, knowing who it is to talk to. And when you're not sure, coming to the department, going to your LARCs where there's one designated, having a conversation with the PBCs where they're available, and just basically starting conversations in which to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage.
Great. And look, there's a really important couple of questions here now. Thank you so much. If you want to stop sharing, Evan, we can all see each other for the important part of the conversation. That's great. And can we also ask just to hold for a minute and have the full screen view and have everybody turn their cameras on, just so that we can get a shot for our reporting. And that would be wonderful, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, have you got a full screen shot able to do their case, couple? Everybody want to do a little wave for Landcare? Say hi. Thanks to Evan. Well done. Okay, thank you for that. So one of the questions is, when will the directory be published, Evan? And someone's listed that already. I think Case has popped that in for people. The next couple of points, as you will see, and I know you're not conversant overly with Zoom, so I'll read these for you. Dimity Bog says, we have existing projects that are contracted to do works that may trigger the Act prior to the 1st of July. How do we proceed? Do we need to retrospectively get approval?
Okay, so activities that are happening before 1st of July won't be affected by this Act, but as soon as the 1st of July happens, you do need to have the correct approvals. So if you're already in a case where you've started those conversations, you've done your consultation, you've got agreements about how Aboriginal cultural heritage in the area is going to be managed, then you're well on your way to having those correct approvals done already, but you do need to have them.
Great, okay. And the next one is, say you've got a tier 2 activity and you require a permit, that what you're doing is going to require a permit. What's the expectation of time that, you know, it could take for that to kick in?
Yep, timeframes is a good one. We do have a document at that link that I indicated at the beginning about prescribed timeframes around those. The first thing you're required to do is send notification to the correct people to be notified. So the LARCs or the PBC, whether it's all sort of stepped out in the due diligence management code. Once you've sent that notification and said, I'm going to be undertaking this tier 2 activity, you receive submissions from that group, and they give you an indication about what harm may occur, and you can respond to that with how you're going to manage that harm. So that's a 28-day period in which notification can happen. And then once you've had that 28-day notification period, you put in your application to the council. All this is done through Acknowledge, through the new IT system. So you can once you've logged on and created your profile in Acknowledge, you can begin your notification. You can have those conversations directly through Acknowledge. You can then put your application to the council. The council then has a period of 28 days in which they will have conversations and ensure that everything that you've written in your application is correct and thorough. They will ensure that notification has happened correctly. And then they have a 14-day decision-making period in which to wrap that up and decide whether to authorise or deny the permit. They're not making a decision on anything to do with the cultural heritage. They're not suggesting whether it's significant or not. They're not deciding whether or not it's appropriate for you to be harming heritage. They're simply making sure that the application has addressed what is reasonable.
Okay, that's a really important point. And the next question is, in that consultation process with the relevant Aboriginal groups, is there a payment required? That service, how will that service be funded?
Right. Okay, so payments is another thing that is prescribed under the Act. However, the Act only speaks to LARCs. So LARCs are able to charge fee for services, and they have a specific set out fee for services guideline. They're able to charge, a LARCs is able to charge up to $500 for notification for a tier 2, and they're also allowed to charge certain fees for certain services in relation to tier 3 activities. Now, because, as I said, PBCs and knowledge holders are outside of the legislation, we acknowledge them, but we can't direct whether fees should be charged. So for someone to be, so one of the advantages of an Aboriginal party to be designated as a LARCs is that they have that set fee structure. The legislation is silent on whether a PBC can charge you for interaction with them for this. It requires you to do that interaction, but it doesn't speak to anything about them charging fees or not. Right,
thank you. And look, I'm conscious of time. I want to get through another couple of questions, but I'm also very conscious to say to the audience that WALN will be doing some more presentations around this and workshops and probably a Landcare build skills, because there's so many moving parts to this for, you know, groups of all sizes really just wanting to progress their work plan in accordance with seasonal change and timing and their projects and their funding, that we really need to get a strong handle on this. And we might do some case studies and put something to you. Are we able to get a simulation of the Acknowledge system up and available for us to work through so that we could look at actually training people in how to go through this process?
I can take that one on notice. I don't know if it is going to be ready and available to do any of that. We've got some groups who have already been notified who will be doing some beta testing for us just prior to 1st of July, but we're talking a matter of 4 weeks at this point, and when DPLH hasn't finished finalising, I think we're aiming for the next 2 weeks to be finalised with our system.
Okay, well, I'll follow that up with you offline. Just another quick couple of questions. Really important one. This is one that will really cause issues in terms of implementation, is what happens if the PBC doesn't respond to your notification within the 28-day period?
Well, they've been given that opportunity to respond, and you put your application in indicating that you've made contact and that they haven't responded. The council then can go through a process of contacting them for response, but you have met your timelines if you have waited that 28 days. You've notified them, waited that 28 days, and put your application in. That's all you're required to do.
Right. Great. So you lodge it, then you've done your part of the process. You can't be held to account if you're not responded. Great. Next question is, can the NRM regional bodies apply on behalf of landholders in the case where they have a contracted partnership, or does the landholder or the person doing the activity need to be the proponent?
No, it's the proponent. They don't have to be the landholder. So it's different to the Section 18 process where it was all about the land being on behalf of the landholder. No, it's the person who's doing the activity. So if it's an NRM group that is contracted to do the activity, they're the ones that are able to apply for the permit or the plan or whatever approvals are appropriate.
Great. Okay. And just a clarification, the Act is only triggered if we are undertaking works on current or likely to become registered as culturally significant sites. For example, if people are cropping on previously cropped country that is not registered, would they have to apply or consult a PBC or not to continue doing what they've always done?
Okay, two things in that. Yes, if it is not, if it's not cultural heritage, if you know that it isn't an area of cultural heritage, no, there's no approvals required. The second thing is that like for like activities are exempt. So if you are cropping a piece of land in the same way that you have been cropping it for any period of time, if that has previously occurred and it's the same activity, then it's an exempt activity. So it doesn't actually, it doesn't trigger the requirement for approvals.
Great. Okay, and one last one. There only seems to be reference to agricultural activities on new farms. I think you've just answered that. Like for like, stuff that's already been happening on established farms doesn't trigger anything there. Great.
Yes, that's correct. But yeah, as I tried to say, you shouldn't just be looking at the agricultural section. You might want to go and have a look at the different, because as I said, if you're putting in new tracks, if you're clearing land, those may be listed on other sections. We've just tried to put in some sort of dividers so that it's an easier read. Those aren't legislated dividers, as it were. So you need to kind of look at all the activities and make sure that none of those are applicable. And if you cannot find one that's applicable, or if you're really not sure about that, either contact the department and ask the question, or look to that catch-all, which is the very last one that's regulated. There's 27, 28 and 29, which is that catch-all that if you're doing an activity.
Great, thank you. What about activities such as deep ripping or other forms of soil amelioration on previously cropped land? So if you're wanting to rip deeper than 200 millimetres.
Yep. So as I said, like for like activities means that you are doing the same activity in the same way over the same land. So if you are going deeper, if you are going wider, then that is a new disturbance. So you'll need to go through the appropriate process. So the same thing, if you're clearing a fire break and it's been a fire break sort of in perpetuity and you're just going along the same track, go for it. Doesn't matter whether it's over the top of Aboriginal cultural heritage or not. However, if you're going wider, if you're going to be clearing more land, then you're going to need to go through the process of deciding whether that's through an area of Aboriginal cultural heritage and what the appropriate approvals for that additional works would be.
So I think you've answered the last question, which is, does it also apply to 1 metre or deeper soil cores where this had previously not occurred on cropping or pasture land?
Yes, it does.
So that's a different activity. It's not like for like. So would the assumption be fair that you would then have to go through the process?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay, so one clarification we might take you just a couple more minutes. Do you have a couple more minutes?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Available? Great. Does the like for like exemption override cultural heritage? For example, cropping has always occurred in that paddock, but the landholder realises that after July 1st, that is a cultural heritage area. Is the activity still exempt?
It does, yes. That's actually one of the areas that has raised a little bit of sort of contention, but in terms of that balance for land users and for simple operation of the Act, we need to consider that if an activity has been done in this way, then yes, it's going to need to continue to be done in this way. So if you are cropping, then, and you've been doing that for the last 50 years, then even if there is cultural heritage in the bottom of that paddock, then you can continue that cropping. There's always the potential for making changes to that. You can have that conversation if you do want to change that. That's great, but there's no requirement under the Act to do that.
Okay, from Katanning again, establishing a tree plantation is listed as Tier 3. Is this the same or different to environmental re-veg planting as opposed, say, to commercial tree farming?
I'm going to say that I wonder if, I'm not 100% sure, but I think revegetation might be listed elsewhere. If it isn't, yeah, that's going to be one of those ones where you should contact the department to ask the question, because I'm going to assume that yes, if you're going to be planting plants, it doesn't matter whether they're going to be cut down for harvesting or not. But I would be happy to take that kind of thing on notice and ask the question. But yeah, it's the same kind of activity. It would have the same impact. So in terms of, it will have the same impact on the cultural heritage.
Right. And another question, I believe the person believes they read, if you don't hear back from ALARC about your application, you're required to follow up a certain number of times over a certain period of weeks to try and get a response. Is that correct or not?
So you've read that in the consultation guidelines, which is great. Now, the consultation guidelines apply in a very specific scenario. They apply if you've got a Tier 3 activity and if you're going to be potentially causing harm to ACH. So if you're doing a Tier 2 activity, you do not need to use the consultation guidelines. But you are correct that the consultation guidelines do step out what appropriate consultation looks like. So if you've contacted the LARCs, made initial attempts to contact, you do have to do a certain number of follow-ups over a certain period to try and get that response.
Okay, fantastic. So we've just shared another link there about that consultation process. Someone's having trouble finding the directory. What I will say now, given Evan's really valuable time, that we will put an email together, we always do after Landcare checks in, and we'll send that out with lots of the sort of information that you're looking for, the links. It's fully recorded, so you'll be able to go to our website and our YouTube channel and look at it again for those of you who want to get clear on points. And I think fairly quickly we'll be looking at, once the system's up and running, perhaps if we can't get into a simulated scenario, to look at getting you back, Evan, and taking some people through the process in real time, potentially, just so that it really starts to clarify, because these, understandably, these kind of questions are going to surface.
Absolutely.
And your help team availability, what is that going to look like? Will that be, people pick up the phone, leave a message or get a call back, or, what's the time frame you think around question answering? What's your resourcing like?
I don't know how that's going to look. We are working on our internal capacity building. You can continue to use that email address, the ACH implementation team, and we will get back to you. We are trying to put together other resources. We've got a team working on some videos at the moment, I believe, some FAQs, those kind of things, and we're going to try and work through those things as quickly as we can. I cannot give you a guaranteed time frame at this point because I don't know what that's going to look like. I do understand that it is going to be hectic, and that a lot of people will have questions, and we are more than happy to answer them. This is, as I said, a really positive move about communication and conversations. It's not a punitive act by any means, and yeah, we're just keen to get Aboriginal cultural heritage protected in an appropriate, balanced way.
Fantastic, Evan. That's a great roundup. Thank you so much for your time. I think the level of knowledge you have and ability to speak to the Act, and we all have to remember, this is an act of government. It's not a simple document. There's many, many layers of it, and it sounds like you're trying to get that into a live system for us to interface with. And we look forward to the next steps in this and having a go. But thank you so much for coming along and giving us your time today.
You're more than welcome. Thank you everyone for attending. I appreciate being able to get the message out there.
Great. And there's one more thing in the chat, another link,
yes,
I think.
I've just sent through the link to the guidelines that I have been speaking about. So that's the one that you need to link to. All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, you've become Zoom savvy. You know how to use the chat now. So you've learned a new skill today. And we've learned so much. Our brains are slightly exploded. So
I imagine they are. I've been working on this for over a year. So that's how long that's been churning around. And I get that this is a lot of information. And that's why I say we are still here for conversations. If you want to organise extra meetings with us, the different, we've already spoken to a number of shires, different Aboriginal groups. Anyone that's really interested in talking to us, we're happy to have conversations.
Great. So anything left in the room? Thank you for thanking us. And to the people who've joined us today, you know, I'm sure that everyone would join me in saying we're all in the environmental space, and we have great respect for First Nations cultural heritage, and everybody, you know, consistently tries to do the right thing. We're not Rio Tinto, and we'll be working very closely with the guidelines and with the First Nations people we work with, past, present and future, to really make sure we get this right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Evan. Thanks, everyone.
Can you stay on, Case, please?